Hello. How's it going?
All is well. Thanks for having this.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know if I've met you before. Omachi, is that
Correct. I go by
pronounced?
Amanch, but my name is Alma. But yeah,
Okay, cool. Are you a V school student?
I am. I'm in the full stack web dev
Oh, nice.
program. Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah. I think I've been to
Um,
one of your other ones. I didn't say anything, but I've been
oh,
to,
okay,
yeah, very informative.
cool. Well, welcome. I'm gonna give people a few more minutes to join in. How far are you in the program?
Oh, I'm on level 2 right now.
Okay,
I'm just like learning transitions and such. Yeah.
sweet.
You're full stack as well? Web.
Um, Yeah, so I taught the full stack program at V School for a
Oh,
couple of years.
oh, cool, cool.
Yeah, and now I just kind of do this as I'm a software engineer at Fidelity right now, but I do this code talk thing as kind of like a fun way to go back to teaching because I love teaching. It's just like my favorite thing.
That's
So
so great.
this
Yeah,
is
I'm
kind
sure
of
you
my
like
way
you learn.
to
Mhm.
this is kind of my way to like give back, I suppose.
For sure. That's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm on Slack and stuff. So if you ever have any questions or whatever, feel free to reach out. I love this stuff.
Oh, for sure. I definitely will. Yeah. I mean, right now I'm learning, I think, error and, or yeah, I think it's, I'm going to try to rephrase what it was, but it's error handling.
Okay.
And kind of like the beginning of coding, I'm just like, why are we using this or why do we need it? And until we get there, then I'll understand better. Like, oh, okay, now I see.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what's tough about coding. Sometimes you learn something and it's not really clear what it's for.
Yeah. I'm just
And
like,
sometimes it just takes time to like really be able to put it into context.
true.
Um, so module two, that doesn't have React in it, right? Is module three React?
I
I
think
left since they switched to the module system, so I don't really know what order things are in anymore.
yeah, I believe it is because it's definitely not in level 2. I'm looking now at my,
Hmm.
but I know it will be. So my thing is, we'll just keep what you can and learn, and it'll be like a nice
Hmm.
reminder when I get to it.
Cool. Yeah, this will be some of it may be a little abstract or I th- when you'll see stuff now that maybe you won't quite understand, but then when you get to it later, it'll be like you'll just be like, oh yeah, I remember seeing this.
Yeah, that's
Um,
what I'm hoping for.
so yeah, so I think this is still really beneficial, and just like testing is just a really important uh, concept to understand generally. So this I think this will I think you'll still get a lot out of this, even though you haven't gotten to React yet.
Yeah, I think I definitely will. I like to be reminded of what I learned later on. I like for it to be like one of those aha, like, oh yeah, and I get that.
Yeah, and like that's kind of how you learn coding is just repeated.
Mhm.
It's just repetition. So
Yeah, absolutely.
cool. Do you like it so far?
I do. I do. And I mean with the whole COVID everything, I do wish it was in person now
Yeah.
more, but um I I'm very sure I picked the right school. So
Cool. Right on. Yeah, I mean, I was a former student as well before I became a teacher, but yeah, I think I'm a little biased, but yeah, I think you picked a good school.
yeah, you're biased. But yeah, that's cool. I didn't have anything else to choose. I mean, I did have the other options, but besides the option for that scholarship, I was also what I liked, what drew me into V School was the responsive learning as well as the inclusivity of it. It just seemed like you would have a lot of help and assistance, and it wouldn't feel creepy or scary, or scary or anything at all. Like everyone's really kind and
Cool.
yeah.
I'm glad to hear. I mean, my experience is very positive as well. Um, Lots of like just really cool, interesting, helpful people.
Yeah. How was it leaving and graduating? Like work related and linking with people, like social networking, like how was it transitioning from school to work?
I mean, it was definitely scary, because it's kind of like leaving the nest, you know.
Yeah.
My experience was, I think, a little different than some others because I was hired as a TA like immediately after the program,
Mm,
and I ended up just really loving it. And so I stayed a lot longer as a TA than I think most people do.
okay.
And like I actually ended up like being like one of the lead instructors because I just liked it so much. So I ended up being there for like 2 years teaching.
Wow, that's
Um,
great.
so I feel like I got to spend a little more time in the nest, I think, than most people do.
Hmm.
But yeah, once I left V school, it was definitely scary, not gonna lie. Like it was kind of bittersweet because you kind of you're not in the same you don't get to see the same people every day anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was like it was exciting too. I mean, I spent most of my time uh, applying to jobs. I'm a huge introvert. I hate networking more than anything, so I
No, I'm
definitely
worse.
struggled with that.
I'm worse.
I
I
don't know. I don't know. We'd have to have like a competition to see who hates networking more.
you lose. We'll see. I'm telling you.
All right. Challenge accepted.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it
It's scary.
sucks. I hate
Yeah, it
networking. It's
does.
the worst. It's the worst because it's like I don't know. I love people,
Hmm.
but I love very small groups of people, and they have to be very specific kinds of people that I like connect with, you know?
Hmm.
And just going to like some networking event where it's like a bunch of extroverts, I just feel like I'm being so fake and
Mm,
needy by being there.
I hear you.
And so yeah, like you totally can empathize. And so yeah, I just hated that part. Um, but I kind of tried to figure out like one of the benefits of being an introvert though is that when you do find a connection, it becomes like a strong one.
Yeah.
And so I think that I think like networking is seen as this like numbers game, like build your network. Um, when I don't actually think that's the right approach. I think rather than building a network, it's form that first connection.
Yeah.
Um, I guess it's like exactly like dating. It's like
Hmm.
once you find that one person, like you don't really need to find more.
Yeah. I mean, my
Not quite the same, but
because I mean, you can have that many networking people, like 50 something. No, you don't need to date that
right.
many. That takes talent. But with my
Yeah.
career advisor, he said the same thing. Like, really focus on building that relationship with people you are networking, not just here, there, here, there. For me, when it comes to people, I love, even big groups. I can be very out there and like, hey, oh my gosh, join in. Let very. I want to bring everyone in. But then
Mhm.
when they're like, hey, what's your Instagram? I'm like, are we not going to see each other again? Like, what? I
Right.
don't I don't have one. I don't like, no, we're not. I don't want to connect that in that way. Sometimes it just feels
Mm.
uncomfortable.
Yes.
Having to
Yeah.
keep up
Same.
with it and having to keep up with it is annoying. I'm like, and people say, well, why you didn't like any of my pictures? I'm like, I like them. I love seeing your face. Let's see it in person.
Right. Yeah. I know exactly what you mean. Like the social media aspect of it it's just so superficial
It
and
does.
it
It
has
really
no
does.
depth at all.
Mhm. Like, I would
Like,
love to just hang out with a small group at a house and we're just watching a movie, just
yeah.
really chilling.
Yeah.
But
That's my favorite.
yeah, the intensity of, you know, I don't know. And I'm not much of a follower. I'm very much of I do my own thing. I'm an Aquarius. I love the weird. Do your own thing. And if you never call me, that's fine. I know you're fine. I'll check in
Mhm.
with you. I know I didn't do anything
Yeah.
wrong, but it's like, I like me. And I don't want the pressure of conforming to like social media and that whole culture of snap
Mhm.
picture. Like, I don't like, I hate I'm not active on Instagram, Facebook, none of those. Twitter I like because I love hearing people's opinions,
Yeah.
but everything else I'm working on getting better at that, but I'm just hoping that's not a hindrance when it comes to,
Yeah.
networking here. I hate
I
that
don't think
idea.
so, because like you seem like a perfectly sociable person,
Yeah, I like
like,
people.
and so like that's not. I don't think that's a detriment at all. It just means you have to use kind of a different strategy, I think,
Yeah.
that works for you. And like what I would do in my application process is I just made a point to reach out to individual people
Mm.
when I was applying. Like I didn't do like the easy apply stuff, like the scatter
Okay.
shot approach. Don't do that. The best thing to do is to look up companies that seem cool and interesting
Yeah.
and try to find people on LinkedIn that work there and just send out messages and just ask them, do enough research so that you have actual questions, and
Yeah.
then find people who work there and ask those questions
That's a
and
great
let them
point.
know that, hey, by the way, I applied to this position. I was wondering if you'd answer, if you could answer this question I have about, working there or whatever. That way, like, yeah, you spend more time per application, but like your the quality of the application is way higher. And my response rate was so much higher when I would actually just reach out to real people. I'd
Cool.
only get like 2 or 3 applications done a day, but like I would get responses from almost all of them.
Wow. That's a really great point. That's a really good advice. You should
Yeah,
share that
so
too. Yeah.
that's something I tell everyone, to like students, especially
Cool.
uh boot camp students for sure.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Good
But
point.
hey, what's up, Xavier?
Hi, Xavier.
Hey, how are y'all?
Well, thank you.
Good. Um, let's see here. Xavier, have you gotten to React yet?
No, I don't think so. I'm in level 2.
Okay, that's okay. So you're in the same module as Omachi.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I don't know where all of my people are at. So I think why don't we because I want to make this, as helpful as possible. And since you guys are here, um do you guys have any questions whatsoever, either in like some of the homework you're working on or any sort of like general concepts or whatever? Like I'd be happy to just kind of go into whatever topics seem relevant to you guys. Since you're here.
No, the React seemed really cool. I mean, I like actually approaching getting into something from the deep dives that you do.
Okay.
I mean, I have no problem with that. I'm getting stuck right now on a bunch of CSS stuff.
Okay.
But
yeah, CSS is
I don't think that's something that you want to go into.
CSS is not my strong point. I'll be honest, but I do know, like, I'm proficient in it. I guess it's not my favorite thing in the world, but I would be happy to look at some CSS stuff.
Same as
Is it
Xavier. I'm down for React. Like I came here for React, but if you guys want to go over
okay?
CSS
Well,
is tricky for me too.
so why don't we? So the original idea was to do the React testing library, but without having like at least a basic understanding of
Oh,
React, the testing library may not be the best thing to do. So let's do this. Let's do a quick intro to React, so you guys can kind of see what you're going to be getting into in the next few weeks. Does that sound good?
I like that.
yeah.
Okay. So first of all, what do you guys know about React so far? Like, what have you heard through the grapevine? Have you done any like kind of research on your own, or like what can you guys tell me about React that you know so far?
I just know that it's necessary and lots of job requirements. It's very popular, and probably one of the most popular ones. That's as far as I really know.
Okay. Yeah, that's definitely true.
Is it associated to Bootstrap?
No.
No, okay.
Not necessarily. They're not connected in any particular way. There are you can use Bootstrap in React. There are Bootstrap libraries that are built using React, but they're not related.
Okay. Well, that's what I know. So obviously I know nothing.
Well, that's all right. So, okay. So right now you guys have been mostly doing like HTML and JavaScript stuff, right? Like what kinds of things happen in module 2? Like what's been like the, I guess, most challenging project so far, as far as like JavaScript and HTML goes?
High order functions, I would say, so far have been the
Okay.
most challenging thing.
Yeah, those are very abstract for sure. What kinds of have you guys done like event listeners, like button clicking and things like that? Like
Yeah.
have you done like the Mario pest control project?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, cool. So um so React is just a JavaScript library. So it's just code that's written in JavaScript that you can import into your own project. And basically, it's like a scaffolding. So a library is just like a set of functions that you can just like use. It's just like, when you go to the library, with the actual library, you go there and you grab some books that seem interesting or useful for whatever it is that you want to, whatever it is you're interested in. So in code, a library is just a set of like pre-written code that you can, that provides you with certain functionalities that are useful for what you're trying to do. So React is one of these libraries that are used for building web applications. It is not necessary. You are perfectly fine using good old-fashioned JavaScript in your websites. But there is a kind of fundamental problem that arises as your application gets more complicated. So as you get more pages and there's more things happening, like you can imagine how complicated something like Facebook is, right? There's billions of pages, there's billions of users, there's so much data and so much just interactivity that can happen on a given screen. And as that complexity grows, it becomes harder and harder to manage how, or it becomes harder to synchronize what the current state of your data is with what you see on the screen. And what libraries like React and Angular and what are some other ones? Meteor. I mean, React and Angular and Vue are like the three. They're like the triumvirate of JavaScript frameworks. But what they're all trying to do is solve that problem, or at least make it easier to manage, which is essentially just boils down to synchronizing complex data with a view. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So like when you were doing the Mario pest control project, you encountered this problem, whether you consciously realize it or not. But do you remember having kind of difficulty with like having the screen update with the right numbers?
Yeah.
Do you remember kind of how challenging that was? Because like you can think it's easy in your head to conceive of these numbers being added together, right? It's like, okay, if I click this button, it's going to add 7 to the total or whatever. And then when I click this other button, it needs to add all of the totals together. But then it's like, okay, well, there's this calculation that's going on, but then it's like I have to display it on the screen at the right time. Like if I click this button, it displays this value at this time, and if I click this button, it displays a different value at a different time. And that can be challenging. That project, I think, is kind of the first time that new developers in V School anyways, or students in V School kind of encounter this problem of trying to synchronize data with what they see on the screen. And what's cool about React is that it provides a very, very streamlined philosophy for how to do this. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share my screen and gonna pull this up. So the first thing, and you'll learn about this. There's this library called Create React App. It's a Node package that basically will kind of bootstrap a React app. It has everything kind of pre-configured and everything. This will look kind of overwhelming at first, but it's really not too bad once you kind of just get used to it. You don't need to worry too much about the way that it's configured and stuff for now. As you get more and more comfortable with React, you'll definitely be curious about how all this Webpack stuff does all this transpiling and stuff, and you'll probably end up looking into how it works and figure it out from there. But for now, it's enough to know that, okay, all the defaults are fine for now, and it gives us a nice starting point. So while we're waiting for this to download, you guys have any questions?
So basically, it's a lot. Go ahead.
No, Oma, you go. I had a silly question.
Okay, thank you, Xavier. I was gonna say, so basically, it's just a pre-installed library package, kind of like NPM, of just built-in things that we could do with JavaScript, but it's kind of like a shortcut. Right?
Kind of, yeah. Like, so create the command line create React app library is basically a command that will just like generate a bunch of pre-written files.
Cool.
And then which kind of is just like a starting point for an application. Okay. And then you can, of course, customize it for your own purposes.
So if you had like a website like Facebook, it would have kind of like the bones of that, right?
Yes. I believe, now I'm not really sure if, well, now Facebook probably has they've got their own whole custom environment set up. It's not likely that they use create React app for that. I mean, they actually created Create React app. So I'm sure they used principles for Create React app in their own project. But think of maybe a better example would be something like I could be wrong, but I think Airbnb used Create React app.
Okay.
So one thing I want to kind of make sure to emphasize is that React and Create React app are not the same thing. React is the actual JavaScript code that provides the tools for building components and building a web application. Create React app is just a scaffolding of files that uses React, that basically has it already pre-installed. It's the difference between going to Home Depot and buying all the wood and buying all the screws to build a bed or something versus buying something from IKEA. With IKEA, like, you're still using, wood and screws and things, but they've kind of compiled it together for you, and you kind of have to do just some minimal things like, you don't have to do any cutting or measuring or anything, right? You just kind of follow the directions and you screw in the things that need to be screwed in. Gotcha. But at the end of the day, there's, it's still wood and you're still using tools.
That makes sense.
That's kind of the difference. React is like the raw materials in this example. The wood and the nails and stuff and the I hope that makes sense.
It does. It does make sense, actually. That was good.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So here we go. It has been created.
Oh, Xavier has a question.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah. That's right.
real quick, Ben. So would that be, and I heard you say folders. So would this be like folders that are prepared to then hold the information for when things happen? Is that why it's so beneficial?
Sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
Like if someone presses the button on the Mario Pest Control, like we
Yeah.
know the first button is going to be 7. Like, does this, in a sense, like make a folder that will understand that a click is going to be worth 7 and hold that information for you so you can use it later?
It gives you the ability to manage that data.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you can do whatever you want with that 7 later.
Oh, absolutely. Like React doesn't know what you want to do with your data. It just gives you some easy tools for making sure that your data is always synchronized with what you see.
Oh, yeah, that's going to be awesome.
Yeah, and there are some conceptual things that you kind of have to wrap your head around, but it's very intuitive. I think what I love about React is it is actually really intuitive for the most part.
Going through and doing the Mario Pest Control yourself, did you find that to be like really challenging? Was it a fun challenge for you? Where were you? Do you remember?
It was a fun challenge. It was definitely challenging for sure. Like, because there's a lot of subtleties in there. Because remember having to deal with the fact that the text on a DOM page is always a string, even though you may be using numbers. And I would always find that I was like trying to add like 7 and 7 together, and instead of getting 14, I would get 77. Stuff like that. Or like if there is no value, adding an empty string to null, it's like you get nothing. You get
Not
like
a
an empty
number.
you get like you get an empty string instead of 0 or something. Like, there's all these like weird edge cases that like I kind of didn't anticipate. But that to me, that's part of the fun of coding is figuring out all these little details.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I found it to be a good challenge, but I was like, man, this is for sure a challenge.
Yeah, it was.
For sure. Yeah. So I think what I'll do for this is we'll do kind of like a little maybe mini example of Mario Pest Control. I mean, we won't have time to like, rebuild the whole thing, but like I can at least give you kind of a bird's eye view of how you would approach that same kind of project in React.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So let's do this. So although you know what, we're going to start with something even simpler, because with inputs and stuff that can get a little more complicated. So let's start with just doing some like basic like, I know this is lame, but like a counter that can like add and subtract from a number. Like you've got buttons that you can either increment or decrement or like reset back to the original count.
Okay.
I know it sounds lame, but it'll be illustrative. So first of all, though, we gotta talk about just some broad concepts with the way that React works. So let's run this. So quick tour. We've got our source code here. And here is kind of the main entry point to the application. So when you run a create React app, it builds this like boilerplate to begin with. We're going to change this. But if you look at this, really the only thing that matters is the fact that, okay, React is a component-based library, which means that we build individual little pieces like Lego blocks and then put them all together, and that's our application. And so it's like a tree, and at the trunk of the tree, by convention, we have the app component. Okay, the app component is just the root of the tree, and all the components are then they branch out from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So here's our app. And if we go to the app file, you'll notice that this looks a lot like HTML, right? It's kind of HTML. It's called JSX. They're almost identical in terms of syntax, but there are some differences, which we'll kind of briefly go over. But if you look at this, you see like, okay, this is pretty straightforward. It's just some what appears to be HTML. We've got like a div, we've got a header, we've got an image here, we've got some text. Okay, so we've got some attributes here, an anchor tag with an href. Okay, this you can, looking at this, being familiar with HTML, you can probably have a general idea of what this looks like. Here's our CSS. Okay, so cool, nothing too crazy. We just got some, some colors, some logos. Okay, cool. So this is our app. It's just a div with a header and some stuff in here. Okay, cool. It's just a little nav bar. Beautiful. All right, let's run it. So to run our code, we're just going to run the command npm start, which is just built into the, that's just a command that is defaulted to us by Create React App. It's just a node functionality. And also the React docs are really, really useful. So if you're curious to learn more, there's some good stuff here. Okay, here we go. So this is what we see. As expected, we got this logo, we've got that text, and then we've got a link. And of course, this goes to the documentation for React. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify all this. So I'm going to take all this crap out because there's too much there. So we're going to start with some very, very simple stuff. We're going to have our main entry point into the program, and then we're going to create a app component, and then we're going to create a counter component. Okay. Oh, also this should be JSX. This will also be JSX, and then this will be JSX. Okay. Actually, no, that can be JS. Okay. So before we write any code, there's a couple of concepts I want to go over. So in React, the first principle of React is that it's component based, which just means that every aspect of the web application is just a bunch of Lego building blocks. Each component is just like a Lego block that serves some very, very specific purpose. And one component can contain multiple other components. Each one of those components can then contain other components, and you just get this tree structure. Just like in Legos, you've got tons of blocks that all kind of build up and work together to form some structure. Second of all, we got to talk about the rendering process. So what I mean by that is React is a very, very special way of making sure that data matches the view or vice versa. And they do it through this thing called the virtual DOM. And you don't really need to worry too much about how it works, other than to know that it exists. It's a thing. And what it is it's basically a big giant JavaScript object. It's huge. Well, it can be huge. And what it does is it's an object that then gets turned into the normal DOM. Okay, so you've got the virtual DOM and you've got the real DOM. The real DOM, of course, is what you see on an actual web page, right? Like if we were to inspect this and look at the elements, like we're getting a nice representation of the DOM here, right? And I could go into my console and I can interact with it. I could be like, hey, or give me the first A tag. oops, spelled it wrong. Right, so with the DOM, I can do stuff like this, right? I can like ask questions about the website to grab elements off the page and do stuff with it. Okay, so the virtual DOM, the way that this works is you have an object that represents your data, and then that object gets converted to the DOM. And if there's a change on the DOM, like let's say there's a click event that happens, or some sort of event happens that triggers a change in the data. Well, the virtual DOM is then updated with the new data. And then there's a smart algorithm that notices where those changes happen and then go to the real DOM and only make the necessary changes related to that particular event. Does that make sense?
Can you rephrase that?
Yeah. So if I have a website and I want to be able to, and I have like a nav bar, and I click on like different links, and it goes to different, let's say like maybe scrolls down, if it's like a single page application, like it scrolls down to that particular header, or maybe it goes to a different page or whatever. But clicking on that button, what is happening is we're triggering a change in the data. The data being a representation of what the current page is.
Yeah.
So what that, in this case, what the virtual DOM does is it goes, oh, hey, a change just occurred to the page, that my data just changed. Well, I better update the DOM so that we see it correctly.
Gotcha.
So it will then go into the DOM and make the adjustment. Does that clarify a little bit?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, cool. And this is a one directional process. Okay, so what that means is that the virtual DOM will always go into the DOM, make the change, and if something happens, it loops back, and the virtual DOM changes, which changes the normal DOM, and it's just a loop. It's a one directional loop.
Okay.
And the reason why is because one direction is a lot easier to manage than two opposite directions. So data flow always goes in a loop in one direction. That's kind of the third principle to understand about React. And that's pretty much it for React. Those are like the three principles you got to know. It's component-based, it's state-based, and it has a one directional data flow. So what we're going to do to start is we're going to render just something to the page. Okay, so don't worry too much about some of the smaller details here, like importing and stuff. Like you'll get a handle on this when you get to Node, or when you get further into Node. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to render some stuff to the screen. So I'm going to say, okay, React. What else do I need? Okay, so this is the entry point to my application. So I'm going to say React DOM render something. Okay. So the render method, you usually only call this once. And what this does is this is where you essentially are just saying, hey, I want you to render my application, render my app component. My app component, of course, is the root of the tree. So we're going to say, okay, for now, let's just do like something very simple. I'm just going to do a little p tag that says hello world.
I'm sorry to interrupt here. Is render going to be a visual rendering of what is happening?
Yep. Think of this as like this, if you pretend that this is HTML, this is kind of saying like, hey, append this to the body.
Perfect.
It's essentially what's happening. There is a middle step with the virtual DOM, but like really, essentially, yeah, this is what you're going to see on the website.
Good
is
question.
this p tag representation in the DOM. Cool. So our first argument is the thing that we want to render, the components we want to render, or in this case, I'm just doing a simple p tag. And then we have to tell it where we want this to render. Okay, so we want to render our application to a specific spot. So if we look at the HTML page, this is what React app gives us to begin with. There's a lot of boilerplate, so we're not going to worry too much about it. But what's really important is here's our body, and here's this div, and they provide this by default. It's convention for our root element to be a div with an ID set to root. Now we could call this whatever we want. This is not like, no one's telling us we have to do this, but it's just kind of the convention. It's like we have to start somewhere. So we're going to start with this div, and as you can see, it's got an ID of root. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, I want you to render this p tag and find that root element. Make sense?
Yeah.
We're saying, hey, React, render this p tag at the root. And if we go to our site, hey, check it out, there it is. And if we look at the DOM, there you go. See, there's our root element, and there it is. Pretty cool, right?
Yeah. So can you go back to the JS? So it knows just to do that at the div, like where the div come from?
Yeah, so the div, this is the HTML page.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep, so that's where that lives.
Gotcha.
Right there.
So you inserted it there. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Okay.
Yep. And then yeah, we're just saying, okay, render this guy at that location.
Mm-hmm.
And I could change that if I wanted to. I could give it a different ID name. I could change it to a span, but you know, a div is a good general purpose element for this kind of thing. Okay, cool. Well, now what we're gonna do is we're gonna show you, we're gonna write our first component. So what I'm gonna do is, instead of doing this p tag here, we're gonna abstract this away a little bit. We're gonna go to a different file, and typically by convention, every individual file is an individual component. That's not always true, but by convention, that's kind of the pattern you want to follow, because then that way it's really easy to find your components, because they're all just named. They're just the file names. So our app is just a component. And the thing I love about React and the thing I love about components is that they are so intuitive. A component is just a function that renders HTML, or it's JSX. It's not really HTML, but it looks like HTML. But a component is just a function that returns some JSX. So it's like pretty obvious what that component looks like when you're looking at the JSX. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna export this guy. Okay, and like I said, this is just a function, and all it's gonna do is return some HTML. There it is. Nothing too crazy. We're gonna go to our index.js, and instead of writing it there, we're actually just gonna go ahead and import the app instead. Okay, this pattern is really common because it lets us, things are a little, when you separate things out into files and import and export them, it's a lot easier to move them around, and they're just a lot more portable. So let's see here. Oh. There we go. All right, so all we did was take that p tag and move it to the return statement of this app. And we go back and check it out. It's the same. Like, it doesn't look any different. Okay, so here's how you can kind of start seeing how these components relate to each other. Okay, so my index.js is rendering the app, which is, of course, is the root of the tree. And my app, since ultimately our goal is to write a little counter application, something that can, like, you know, go up and down in the count. Let's make that component. Okay, so instead of rendering a p tag from our app, we're going to render this counter, and it's going to follow the same pattern that we did for the app. So in this case, like, let's make we'll make a little container for our app, and then in here is where we'll render the counter here. So let's go ahead and make that really quick. And then export. Cool. All right, so again, what's cool about this, because it's a component, is that I only have to worry about what this particular thing looks like. So in this case, I want this to be just a div. We'll have a p tag that has the total. We'll worry about the actual value in a second. And then we'll have a button. Okay, we'll have a button that lets us add, and we'll have a button that lets us subtract, and we'll have a button that lets us reset. So again, this should look pretty straightforward. It's just HTML-ish. And yeah, just a div, p tag, button. Okay, cool, awesome. For now, for our number, we'll just put in a 0. Okay, so this little component is only responsible for rendering anything related to this counting functionality. So in order for us to kind of see this, because of course, if we go to our app, we're still seeing our hello world. In order to see this, we've got to import it into our render tree, which of course our app is the root of that. So let's grab the counter. And we're going to pull it into the app. And you do that by, I know this is where things look a little different than normal HTML. Right, first of all, notice that it's capitalized. By convention, you capitalize components. But what's cool about components is that they essentially behave as HTML elements, at least from a syntax point of view. So as you can see, this counter function is just looks like a div with a p button or a p tag and some buttons. Our app renders that counter, which of course, what you'll actually see is whatever this function is returning. So when we go over to our app and we refresh, hey, check it out. Any questions so far?
Do the counters take any properties or attributes at all?
That's a great question. Absolutely, if we wanted to. So because components are just functions, we absolutely could put arguments to this function. And that's essentially what attributes are. So I could give this an ID if I wanted to. I could give it a class name if I wanted to. I could give it whatever custom properties I want because it's just a function, which is really cool. We won't go into, I'll do that part last though. But that's a really great question because yeah, to answer your question, yes, you absolutely can put attributes in. You just have to code what those attributes should be. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. So for now, we're going to keep this empty, but we will come back to that in a minute.
Okay.
So, all right. Right now we've got kind of the UI set up, which is nice. It looks good, but of course it doesn't actually do anything. So this is kind of the next step. So now with Mario Pest Control or with like the calculator project, you probably remember having to do something like this. You know, like const button equals document dot query selector button or whatever, and then you have to do button dot add event listener, and then in your event listener you you know, do stuff. Right? Does this look somewhat familiar?
Yep.
So in React, a lot of this is actually implicit. Okay, so there's not really a whole lot. You're never going to be doing stuff like this in React. Very, very rarely would you explicitly be dealing with the DOM. For good reason, because the virtual DOM is what's responsible for updating the real DOM. It's not our job. That's the virtual DOM's job. Our job is to simply provide the data. So our data, in this case, is what? What do you think our data is? What are we using to represent our data?
More similar HTML stuff.
Not quite.
I just threw that out there. I'm not
The
sure.
user event.
Nope. It's even simpler than that. What is the job of this component? If you look at this application, what's the job of this?
To display the text and buttons.
Yeah, and more specifically, to display the count, right? And to manipulate the count.
Yeah.
So our data is the count. Our data is just whatever that number happens to be. Does that make sense?
Even
Yes,
if it's going to change?
Yep. So data, of course, is meant to change, right? That's why it's so useful. So the job of our component is to simply just show the most updated value for that count. So our data is essentially the value of that count. Like that's what our raw data is.
Okay.
So we simply have to devise a way to keep track of that data. And once we know what the data is, then it's absurdly easy to render it. And we don't have to worry about manually updating like the inner HTML or the text. We can just have a direct reference from the JSX to the value of our data, which is really cool. So let me show you what I mean. So React provides us a way for managing data, and it's called state. State is a really important concept in React. What state means is just like the state of the union. It's the current snapshot of your data. And anytime that snapshot changes, then React triggers that whole rendering process that I told you with the virtual DOM. So to use state, there is a function called conveniently use state. And what it does is it provides us with the current state of that value. We have to define it though, of course. It doesn't care what your value is. Its job is just to make sure it's synchronized with what you see on the screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this function called useState to define what our starting value is. We'll start at 0 because that seems to be a sensible place to start for a counter. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const count, and set count is equal to React use state. Okay, let's break this down. Use state is just a function, and it takes whatever value we want as an argument. So our counter, of course, this is a number, so we're going to use 0. But this could be any value. It could be an array. It could be an object. It could be an array of objects. It could be as complicated of a data structure as you could possibly imagine. But in our case, we're just going to use 0. We're just using a number. So what we get, though, from this function is an array. We get an array of 2 things. The first item in the array is whatever that value is. Okay, so count in this case would be 0. But then what we get is we get this fancy little function which lets us change that count. Now, this is an ES6 pattern. It's called destructuring an array. Have you guys heard of that before? Like, have you seen this syntax before?
I have not.
Okay.
For naming.
So just so this may look a little jarring, but just so you can see that it's not really that crazy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just define a variable called our state. Okay, I can call that whatever I want. Just remember that state is an array and it has 2 things in it. Does that make sense? So the first item in the array is the actual value itself. The second item in the array is the function that lets us change that value. That's it.
So instead of having to assign an array to a variable, you're able to have the variable itself as an array.
Yeah, I mean, like this is just a normal variable, right? And it's just being assigned to whatever the output of this function is.
But when
the output of this function just happens to be an array.
Okay.
But ES6 gives us kind of a clever way to kind of, so right now, because this is an array, to access that first item, I'd have to do state 0. To access the second one, I'd have to do state 1. Those are fine, but it's a little abstract. And if I wanted to like get any sort of meaning from it, I'd have to do something like this. Okay, so count is the first item, and then our set count is the second item. So that's fine. But what ES6 lets us do is they give us a really concise way to do the exact same thing, which is to simply use this bracket notation like that. And then I don't have to do that. Does that make sense? It's like I'm unpackaging something out of an Amazon box or something.
That's so freaking cool.
Yeah, it's pretty rad. And you can do that with objects too, just so you know. Cool, so we've got this variable count, we've got this variable set count. Beautiful, okay. Just so you can see what this count actually is, what we're gonna do is here, instead of a 0 that we've put here, this is just a piece of text, right? I explicitly put that there. I just hard coded in a 0. Well, let's make this a little more dynamic. Instead of putting a 0, we're now going to put the count there. And the syntax for JSX is a little strange, but I think it makes sense. Use these curly braces to essentially like jump out of JSX, and now you can just use normal JavaScript inside. So when you see these curly braces, what that means is that, oh, there's a JavaScript expression in there. So what ends up happening is whatever the value of this is, it's going to get injected there. It's like a template. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I just set that to 0. Here's my count, and I've just basically injected it into my little HTML template here. All right, let's see what it looks like. If I go back, Okay, look, it looks the same. It's a 0 still. Okay, just so I can prove to you that it is actually getting that value. I'm going to set that to 10. We're going to go back and check it out. It's 10 now. Pretty cool. Okay, so the really cool part though is we're now going to use this set count. Okay, now there's a lot of different ways to do this, but what's necessary in this case is that we've got to trigger a click event. So as you probably remember from doing Mario Pest Control, you had to add event listeners to your buttons so that you could, process the action. So in this case, we're going to set a click listener to all 3 of our buttons, and they're all going to do different things. So when we click that button, we want it to increment this by, we'll say 1. If I click this button, it's going to subtract by 1. If I click this button, it's going to set it back to 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to write functions that do that. Okay, so I'm going to call one function increment. Okay, and what this is going to do is it's going to set the count equal to whatever the count is currently plus 1. Okay, I'm going to do the same for another function. And actually, no, before I do that, let's see how this plays out. So
you'll need to input increment, right?
Say what?
You'll need to input increment in that button or in that.
Yep, exactly. We're going to implement increment into the button. So what we're going to do is I'm going to say on my button, I'm going to say when this gets clicked, and notice this is just one slight difference between normal HTML and JSX, is that this says on click, and it's camel cased. But you'll learn those details later. Okay, so we've got this on click, and what we're going to say is we're going to say, okay, when this button is clicked, do the thing that I want you to do, which in this case, of course, is increment.
Cool.
Notice though, I'm not doing this. I'm not calling the function. I'm just saying, hey, this is the thing I want you to do when the time comes. If you do this, you'll get into an infinite loop. Too many re-renders. So we don't want that to happen. So let's go back. There we go. Okay. So on click will use the increment function. The increment function simply says set count equal to whatever the count is currently plus 1. So when we go over here, and if I hit this button, if I did this right, hey, check it out.
And the only reason why it started as 10 is because the first argument. Okay, gotcha.
Yep, because if I change this to 0,
we'll go back.
Check it out. There it is, 0. Now we go like that. Goes up.
Cool.
Yeah. So that's only 15 lines of code. That's pretty awesome. And it's pretty clean looking, I think.
That makes the reduce method that I used look like child's play.
Yeah, so I hope you can already start seeing the benefit of this. Cool. So all right, well, decrement follows the same exact pattern. It's really not that different. We're just going to call it decrement, and instead of plussing, we're going to subtract, and then instead of we're just going to say decrement right here. Okay, cool. And what we can do is we can go back over here. And we're gonna go like that. Oh, no.
The click was spelled wrong, I think.
Oh, yes, thank you. That's a lowercase.
Yeah, lowercase.
There we go. And check it out. Hey, it works. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I think I'm sure I know the way you described it's not difficult. I know syntax is a big cause for bugs. So learning a different syntax, it's like, oh, okay, I can get this, but I'm sure I'm gonna be checking my syntax constantly for bugs and stuff.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And that's just part of it. Eventually it'll be like
Yeah.
reading English.
Right.
And like linters help with that kind of stuff too. And if you ever get into TypeScript too, the TypeScript is really helpful.
Winters and TypeScript.
TypeScript. If you get interested in TypeScript.
Okay.
TypeScript is not part of the curriculum, but
Cool.
it is a really cool language. I use it at work. And it catches, like it would catch something like that. It's pretty awesome.
Okay.
All right. Okay, cool. So our last one is our reset function. Okay, and here, instead of, now it doesn't matter what our count is. We just want to set it back to 0. Okay. So on click, reset. Sweet. So if we go back over here, let's go, oops. Refresh. Okay, so let's put it to 5 or 6. And if I hit reset, if I did this right, it should go back to 0. And if I go like -5 or 6 and hit reset, it goes back to 0. Awesome. So that's pretty cool, right? I think that's cool. Now, this is where I actually want to get back to your that question you had, Amachi, about attributes. Because this is a perfect case of where something like that would be useful. Suppose I don't really want to be, let's say I don't want this to necessarily be 0 all the time. What if I wanted to have a starting value? Well, because this is just a function, we can define as an argument what we want that initial value to be. And so that when we actually use the counter, we can tell it, because we care about how we're implementing the counter, we can tell it what it should start at. So what we're going to do is we're going to use, we're going to add an argument here called props. Now, this does not have to be called props. It's just a function. I can call this whatever I want, right? It's just a variable. But I can't do something like this, unfortunately. As much as you would want to do something like this, React gives us a very, very specific way to use attributes on a function or on a component, and it has to be an object. Okay. I mean, I can call this initial value, but you just have to remember that it's actually going to be an object. And that object, by convention, we call props, which is short for properties. So properties, attributes, you could really call it whatever you want, but props has just kind of been that's just the convention that people use nowadays. So what we're going to assume is whatever attributes that we give or properties that we give to this counter, one of those values, we expect it to be initial value. Okay, so now instead of setting this to 0, I'm going to set this to props.initial value, or let's call it initial count. Okay, so now what we've done is we've offloaded the responsibility of defining the initial count from the counter to whatever component is rendering the counter. And let's also make a reference here so that when we reset, it resets to whatever that value is. Okay, so now the question is, well, where does this come from? If we go back to the app where the counter is being rendered, well, this is the only place we could do it. So what we're going to do is we're going to say initial value, and we're going to set this to whatever we want. So what's cool about this is that I could say 5, for example. Or sorry, I'm not supposed to say initial count. Okay, so I want to emphasize the connection between this and this. Okay, so we say initial count here. That is a property on the props object. And then we're simply using it inside of the scope of this function. Does that make sense?
Can you run that back one more time, please?
Yep. So starting from where we're actually rendering the counter, we're defining a property called initial count. And we're setting it to the value, in this case, 5. It could be whatever value we want.
Gotcha.
And inside of that function, props is the variable that we're using to define that object. That object, because of what we just did here, that has a property, or that has a name called initial count. We defined that. We can call it whatever we want. And that's where that's what that value is. When we say props.initial count, we're talking about this guy right here.
Gotcha.
So it's just like HTML, right? It looks just like HTML, minus a few different syntax things, like these curly braces and this uppercase is a little weird, but other than that, it's basically HTML. So if we go to our app and I refresh, check it out, it's 5 now.
Yeah.
But check this out. This is where component-based applications are really, really powerful. Because what happens if I do this? So I literally am just calling a bunch of counters. If we go over here, they are. And I can reset all of them to their initial values. I can independently use all of them with hardly any new code.
Wow. So you needed to have props like as a parameter. You didn't.
Yep. Because if you don't have that defined, then there's no way of accessing what's being passed into this function.
An initial count could not be in there.
Say that again.
Initial count could not have been in there.
Right. Yeah. Because if you don't have this variable defined, then there's no way to access.
Gotcha. There's no value. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And this isn't React. This is just JavaScript. Like, this is just a function, and so that's just a rule of functions. Like if you don't provide a variable here, then how could you possibly have access to something that is passed into it when it's called?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, how could someone deliver something to your house if you don't provide an address?
Okay.
So that's kind of this is kind of the bread and butter of React right here. There's a lot more, but they all kind of fall from this basic pattern.
So testing wise, I mean, how would you grow from here to then start truly not truly, but like meaningfully test things?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So to test something, when you're the way that software is tested, of course, is to basically run your program in a controlled environment and basically give it inputs and check that the outputs are what you expect. So in the case of this, testing it would essentially come down to making sure that by providing it the correct initial counts, that the counts are displayed accurately. It would be making sure that when a click event is fired on this button, that the value that you see here is accurate, is updated properly. That is essentially what testing comes down to in terms of like, something like this.
How does the middle ground portion of this work with testing?
What do you mean by middle ground?
I mean, oh gosh, shit, I don't know if I'll be able to even explain this.
That's all right.
You were saying that watching a variable's count, that's something that gets lost quite often with the vanilla JavaScript that we're doing.
It can be hard to keep track of as things get more complicated.
Oh yeah, for sure. But you were saying this keeps track of all of that for you, right? Sorry, we're having the dog go potty.
All good.
I guess I would just need to play around with it more. But if the count, say you're testing something and the count isn't correct, what happens?
So you actually bring up a really good question, which is fundamentally more of a, like, if this is already doing stuff for me, why am I retesting it?
That's my question.
Yeah. And that's a really fantastic question, because that really comes to the root of like, you know, testing in general, which is like, you know, what should you test and what shouldn't you test? So now what we're doing here, this is a very, very simple example. So we know that React has been tested pretty thoroughly. So there's not really a reason to test some of the basic things that, you know, React does for us. There's no reason to retest that. So we have to separate our own implementation versus the tools that we are given. So for example, let's say you've got a toolbox, right? You don't need to test the hammer. You need to test the thing that you're building with the hammer. Does that make sense? Oh, he got kicked out. Hey, sorry, I think you got kicked out somehow. Oh, can you hear me?
So sorry, I had to switch over to my phone.
Oh, no worries, no worries. I figured you got kicked out or something. Anyways, I'm not sure if you caught that last part, but so React gives you hammers and nails and tape measures and stuff. And when you're building stuff, you don't need to test the tools that you're using. You want to test the thing that you're building. And so in this case, we're building a counter, right? We're building a thing that's supposed to, you know, just show some very basic data. And so while we can be pretty confident in this case that, you know, React is working properly, we still want to test to make sure that our implementation is doing what we expect it to do. React has no way of knowing that we want it to increment by 1, or we want it to decrement by 1, or reset or whatever. Like, React doesn't do that. The tape measure doesn't know what you're measuring. It's just a tape measure. We know what we're measuring though, and we just want to make sure that the thing that we're building is doing what it's supposed to do. Does that like help answer your question?
It does. Yeah. Sorry, I was kind of moving around there, but I heard what you were saying. Yeah.
Cool. But like, that is a really good question. And sometimes it's not exactly clear what needs to be tested and what doesn't need to be tested. Like with this particular example, the things that I would want to test for are, I would just want to make sure that the initial count is accurate based on what I provide. I would want to make sure that the buttons are doing the right things when I click on them, because that's how this thing's being used, right? Like if this was out in the real world, if this is like a real application that people were using, I would just want to make sure that the way that it was being used, I have confidence that it's providing the correct outputs. But this can get very complicated very quickly, especially once you start talking about doing API requests and asynchronous things. Like, I want to fetch some data from an API and then render that data on the screen. But there's a lag time that happens because when you're making an API call, it takes time to go across the network. And so you have to wait for that data to come back. And so you only want to change the data when the data has come back. But what if the server's down? Then you have to have a fallback option, and you have to decide what those fallback options are. And when you're testing, you'd want to set up your test environment to test for all those cases. You'd be like, all right, well, let's set up a fake error message from a fake API, and we'll call the fake API, and we'll just make sure that our component is rendering the error message given this this particular situation. Otherwise, we'll set up a case where the data is coming back correctly, and we just want to make sure that it displays that data correctly. And there's 1,000 different ways you could go from there. But yeah, this is the basics. You'll get there. You'll get to the API stuff.
Thanks for going over that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. Do you guys have any other questions or anything?
It's pretty amazing that this is just the basics of it, but that was a great intro to it.
Yeah, like try not to get too overwhelmed. I know there's a lot of new stuff, and I didn't really explain like every little thing I was doing, but I didn't want to overload you guys with too much info. But yeah, this is just kind of like a little sneak peek. So when you actually do get to this, you'll be kind of reminded of what you saw before. But yeah, like this stuff gets really interesting. Like this is just the basics, but like, man, when it gets into like conditional rendering and like APIs and like doing like theming, and there's just so many cool patterns you can do with this too. Like this is a super simplistic implementation, but because they're just functions, like there's just so many cool things you can do, so many awesome patterns. And one of the things that I'm just personally obsessed with patterns in coding, like I think that's why I like coding so much, is because you just get to play around with these puzzles and patterns, and I'm just obsessed with making efficient patterns. And there's just cool stuff you can do.
Cool.
But yeah, that's all I got for today.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you guys joined. This is fun.
Yeah.
No, yeah, it was an excellent day of learning.
Sure.
Good. I'm glad to hear. Right on. Well, you guys have a great rest of your day.
All right. Well,
And,
thank you, Ben.
You are welcome. I'll talk to you
Appreciate
guys
it. Have a
later.
great night.
Yep, you too. See ya.